Well, there's a number of layers to it. But from the colonial era, from the time of the Botswana Land Protectorate, which is starting in 1885 and ending in 1966, we had three categories basically of land. We had tribal land, which is otherwise known today as communal land. We had land that belonged to the government of the day, then the British government, so it was called Crown land, but otherwise it's state land today.
Dr. Jeff Ramsay, welcome to the 20th Avenue podcast, sir.
Okay, wonderful to be here.
Yes, sir. Before we get into business, just like to introduce yourself, especially to the younger generation. They're not aware who Dr. Jeff Ramsay is.
Well, I'm the principal of Livingston Colaban College right now. I am, I think, well known as a historian locally, and I worked in government for 15 years in the office of the president, but that was sort of a separate vocation.
Okay.
Otherwise, I've been mostly in education.
Okay. As a historian, what's your main focus?
Botswana history, absolutely, and then Botswana history in relation to the rest of the region.
Okay, so you also an expert when it comes to Southern African history, Africa as a whole.
I studied it in graduate school, got a doctorate in it, so I guess so. But more particularly, I'm focused on Botswana and Southern Africa.
And that always been the space as a historian. For kids who want to be historians, how are the opportunities?
Well, I think you can study history just to know one's identity as part of a broader-based curriculum. History is usually placed in the social sciences and or humanities, and there's value in, as far as I'm concerned, in an education that incorporates natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, etc. So if you're going to ask me how many jobs there are for historians, not many. But if you're going to ask me, can history prepare you for many jobs, that I can say affirmatively, absolutely. There's so many professions, particularly in communications and law and the likes. I'm unusual in that, to a certain extent, I've made a living as a historian because I've been a history teacher. But much of my life I've done other things as well. Very few people can be history teachers, though there's always a little bit of demand for that. But many people can benefit from history.
So what brings me here today? I paid you a visit. I just want us to have a quick conversation. It's an election year. A lot of countries are going to be voting.
Yeah.
Talk of America, South Africa, Botswana, India, etc., etc.
All over the place.
Yes, all over the place. So young people have a lot of questions. Some are first voters. There's a lot of people that they don't understand, things that happened in the past.
Okay.
So we believe you're the best person, like a historian. One of the major issues is the issue of land distribution. So can you just provide a brief overview of the history of land distribution among tribes in Africa?
Sure. Well, there's a number of layers to it. But from the colonial era, from the time of the Botswana Land Protectorate, which is starting in 1885 and ending in 1966, we had three categories basically of land. We had tribal land, which is otherwise known today as communal land. We had land that belonged to the government of the day, then the British government, so it was called Crown land, but otherwise it's state land today. And then we had a very limited amount of freehold land. That was land that had been given by the British, or at least allowed to go by the British to one or another private company, like, for example, the British South Africa Company in the case of much of Gaborone region, and Lobatse Block and Tuli Block, and even Hansi, and the Tati Company in the northeast. So those were private companies, and much of the land that they were allowed to administer, which was to the greater extent granted by the colonial regime, much of that land is today freehold land.
Okay. So who has determined to say this is tribal land, this is freehold, this is crown land, this is what's
Well, the demarcations mostly occurred in 1899 because the British wanted to do that. And everything is relative. Compared to much of the region, a great deal of our land remained either legally tribal land, what you'd see in the so-called tribal reserves, which still exist today. They're part of the law unless we amend the law. So even if we say today that we don't have a Hamangwatu kingdom or a Bakwena kingdom or something, we still do have the land acts which define the tribal lands. And so those can only be changed by legislation, though I doubt that it's necessary. Because what we have done, instead of changing that act, is over time we've created land boards. We took away, in the early years of our independence, the power of Dikosi to allocate land, for better or for worse, and granted that to these land boards, elected and appointed. And so they're the ones who are tasked with administering much of the land, and not only in what were the historic tribal territories, but it was expanded to incorporate much of the state land of Botswana. You know, if we talk about Kalahari districts and areas like that, Chobe and what have you. So in that context, then if we have a problem in this country, and it's not a new problem, it's in fact something that's been on the lips of people for decades now, the question is, how well are the land boards performing? Are they doing a good job of allocating land? And that has been a constant issue. It's not an easy issue. It's also natural in any society for people to want to accumulate land. The downside of that is you can have land hoarding. I say all of that because for much of Botswana, we don't have freehold land. We have de facto state and communal land. And if we are having a problem of allocating that, then that's a problem that we need to resolve amongst ourselves. It's not necessarily a legacy of colonialism in the same way that, for example, in South Africa or Zimbabwe, much of the land was alienated from the indigenous population. And well, in Zimbabwe, half of the land, but most of the best land, was given to a handful of white farmers. So that was something that had to be resolved during and after independence struggle. In the case of South Africa, most of the land that belonged to the indigenous population was taken by Boer farmers and others. And again, that is a serious issue today, how to resolve it. It's not an easy issue. Here in our country, we have things similar to that if we do talk about, say, the Northeast with the Tati Company, or maybe the Ramsay farms. I hesitate to, in the case of, say, Gaborone, because Gaborone, it has evolved into what is not the Gaborone we see today, which is our capital city with de facto people buying and selling land. At the same time, though, of course, there's controversy. Some people have grabbed many plots. And we had a land commission it's been almost 20 years now that this issue really popped up as a very biting issue. There was a land commission report. It found all sorts of abuses, but you know, some of the patterns are still there. There was, you know, so it has been and will remain, no doubt, a political issue.
And a lot of people feel like land was taken, stolen, especially the crown land. Like it's way past independence, and the crown land is still owned by the British.
No, it's not.
It's not.
The crown land, which was the government land that the British crown, that is the British government, had taken, that's our state land. So if it belongs to a government, it belongs to the government of Botswana.
Oh, okay.
So the only British who can own land here are people who happen to own land here. Now, in the case of the Tati Company, that's still a very much a live issue. And it's probably an issue that could have and should have been resolved some time ago. because that is a colonial legacy where most of the Northeast District was granted as a concession initially supposedly by the Matabele king Lobangula. But at least by 1905, the possession of the Tade Company over most of the Northeast was confirmed by the British government. At the same time, Tade was integrated into the Bechuanaland Protectorate. So when we look at an area like that, we have a pattern very similar to what we see in Namibia, South Africa, Zimbabwe. But when we look at Botswana more broadly, a lot of the land issues in places like Central District, Kalahari, and the likes, those are a different set of issues. That's really how well are the land boards administering the land? Are our land policies such conducive for Botswana to have access to the land just as their forefathers had?
Okay. So this question, it's two questions in one. What's your take on the demarcation of borders, like the creation of borders? Was it really necessary? Is it really necessary at the moment?
Is it?
The creation of borders.
Yeah, the creation of borders, it's a product of history, right?
Yes.
And I think what is important, it's easy to anywhere in the world, never mind in our own region, to say, well, this border could be here or here. Wouldn't it make more sense? Maybe because the people over there are similar or that. But I think that the then Organization of African Union, the precursor to today's African Union, made the correct decision back in 1963 to agree that we will not, by force of arms or anything like that, try to alter the borders. Instead, we shall accept the borders and work together towards African unity, African cooperation. In that way, we can hopefully avoid the sad history that we see in Europe and other places where border disputes have led to wars for generations. I mean, and so we are not, even though we may have a predominant ethnic group in one country or another, in the case of Botswana, although we have many languages and groups, it's true that the majority are Setswana speaking, and the nation's name Botswana is reflective of that. And again, that can be debated as well. But we know at the same time that there's more Setswana speakers across the border.
Yes.
That is just the way we are structured here in Africa. Some people would prefer to redraw the borders, but how are you going to do that and not create endless conflict? Isn't it better that we as Southern Africans and more generally as Africans simply work together to make those borders less meaningful? And we have the benchmark of Europe, where for generations borders were just drawn with blood. But nowadays the European Union has open borders, and the sting of borders has, as a result, receded. The Hungarians have historically been very upset since the World War I because so many Hungarians were left out of the Hungary. I suppose I should wait for this. In 1920, the Treaty of Trianon that ended the First World War for Hungary resulted in Hungary losing most of its land, including many lands where Hungarian speakers were. And that has been an issue for them. But it's much less an issue today because Hungarians living in Romania, in Slovakia, in Serbia can easily move around with Hungarians living in Hungary proper, because you have free movement of peoples throughout much of Europe these days. So the impact of borders has become much less divisive than it was in the past. That is hopefully what we're working towards in the African Union, and also in organizations like SADC, that the borders should be a border that's jurisdictional, but not a barrier to the free movement of peoples, and ultimately, hopefully, to the free movement of goods. Though right now, of course, we have issues of we're protecting certain products in this country, so the short term and the short term measures and the long term vision may be at variance.
Because from what I see, the creation of borders actually created a division amongst people, natives. You have people, like you said, South Africans who speak Botswana, South Africans, Botswana from Botswana. Families were cut into two. With people Kalanga speaking Zimbabweans, Kalanga speaking Botswana.
Yes.
Families were cut into two.
But if it wasn't that way, how would you draw the border? On the one hand, you might have some microstates like Venda, but even if you draw borders of Venda, you probably have many Venda people outside. If you talk about Setswana speakers, many of the areas where Setswana speakers are also inhabited by mixed race people, by Boers, by Xhosa, by other peoples. And so it's the same as in Europe. It's not unique to Africa. To draw a border along ethnic lines is not always easy. And one can question whether the ethno-state is the best model anyway. South Africa, of course, wants to be a rainbow nation, embrace all of its peoples. And in the case of South Africa, I mean, I don't see what the alternative is. Some Boers still wish they had an Afrikaner homeland, but where are they going to have it? Where are they in the majority? And even if they were in the majority in a particular area, which would, I'm sure, be too small for a viable homeland, you'd still have a minority. It's true that in the Zulu would dominate KwaZulu-Natal, but we still have Indians there, English, other people there. And the world is going in the other direction. You look at not just countries like the United States or Brazil, but Europe these days, multi-ethnic, multilingual. So in a globalizing world, trying to create, unique ethno-states, it's a challenge. And in Africa, I would say it would be a huge challenge. We could have, how many languages do we have? Plus or minus 1,000 on the continent. Different people will count them. But we've already got 54, 55 states, depending on how you count it. 54 in the AU. If we were to have 1,000 or more states, would that make for a better Africa?
So, sorry to cut you off. Prior colonization, would you say they were border like our countries, like, was it just one country, or like how were countries demarcated?
There were different kingdoms, and some states were highly organized, and some were not so organized in the classic sense that yes, some were empires or kingdoms. They had hierarchical social orders. They had large areas of land under their jurisdiction, while there were some communities which lived in relatively decentralized types of governing situations. Even then, it didn't mean that the borders were ethnically defined. Like the Ethiopian Empire, which grew under Menelik, but even in earlier times, it was multi-ethnic. The Amhara were dominating it by the end of the 1800s, but there were always Tigrayans, Oromo, other people in that empire. So Ethiopia today is both a kingdom that, notwithstanding Italian occupation for a few years, is an indigenous polity that has survived and can trace its roots at least to the times of the Romans. Yet it is a multi-ethnic state, and ethnicity has been and remains a challenge to the Ethiopians.
So how are they allocating land amongst each other?
What I can say is that it's what's common to many places, and certainly in Setswana, but I don't think the Ikalanga system is. There's some differences in detail, but land in general used to be allocated by the traditional leaders. In the case of Setswana, by Dikosi, and that was their role. And the way they did it, well, it wasn't simply the Kosi of the central Kosi or the paramount Kosi or Kosi Kolo who did all it. A lot of the allocation was done through lineages. So, smaller Dikosi or Kosana were allocating. And in so doing, of course, in the case at least of Setswana, or even more broadly Sotho-Tswana peoples, you have the mediating force of Kotla, where people are consulted, and normally things are worked out. More so that the population in Botswana, even today, it's relatively small. If we're talking about before independence, it was up to 500,000 in a country that's relatively large. So while certain lands might be fought over in terms of, a particular river or this or that, there was a lot of land that could be allocated. And what was different then than now is people would use the field, then if they abandoned it, it went back. Whereas nowadays, normally when people register what's a tribal land, they try to keep it. Now, government in recent years has tried to look into where there's tribal land that's not being used so that it can be taken back. But there are legal and other challenges to doing that, which has made it difficult. So that's where we would have a lot more land hoarding probably today than in the past, where people were allocated fields for their use, but at the same time Marafi tribes would move around, people would come and go. Your field in one generation might not necessarily be your fields in another generation.
So how does the concept of landlords emerge now? Because land has been distributed by the horse and stuff like that. But now, after colonization, like after independence, like even before independence, there's people who own houses, they're landlords and stuff like that.
Well, people didn't technically own anything. It depends on what we're talking about, but even in the colonial era, Dikosi still owned, or at least when we say owned, Dikosi were the trustees of the land. It was tribal land, and for example, many of the Europeans who built shops, some of them built shops on the ground, but for many years they built shops on stilts or prefabs because they knew that the Dikosi may move the village, and they also knew that if you were a European or an Indian trader and you set up a shop in a place like Mulipololi, you don't own that land in the past. And the Dikosi could chase you, and you had not much recourse. So it's really with independence that we get land boards. We also get court cases which consolidate land rights in tribal areas, historically tribal areas. But I say historically, like I say, the Act is still there. The Act hasn't changed since 1933. And then it only changed to incorporate Tlokwing into the Act. Most of it dates back all the way to 1899. So that's one set of acts. But then, like I say, the Tribal Lands Act is superseded to a great degree by the land acts that came after independence that established the land boards and the current framework.
And to what extent would you say Botswana or Africans at large were aware of land ownership issues prior to the independence of their respective countries?
Well, ownership issue, first of all, it would vary from place to place because there certainly has been concepts of ownership. Having said that, though, traditionally much of Africa is more communal in its social worldview than what we would see in, say, more hardline capitalist situation. So land was seen as a communal asset to be shared, not in much of Africa. I think we can assume all of Africa. And so in that context, it was something you used, but you didn't accumulate capital necessarily by accumulating land, with some exceptions. Now, if we were to go to some other places like the Americas, by this time you have plantations, whether they're manned by slaves or just large farms. Large farms not only produce things, but they serve as capital. So if I have a lot of land, I can use that to raise money. And that's certainly, of course, what we have today here in Botswana and across Africa. Land is a very great asset. I mean, we've got Mr. Mahang who's talked about this quite a bit. He realized after studying abroad and this and that the key to wealth is very often land. And in any set of assets, if you can have land, it's generally a good asset.